If we could just go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Oh, just, yeah. Back one. Fab. So before we launch into the webinar, just a little bit of housekeeping to cover. So you will have hopefully noticed that closed captions or subtitles are enabled already. So you can turn these on or off by clicking on the CC icon at the bottom of the screen, which will give you the option to show subtitle, and you're also able to change the size of those as well. My colleague Miriam, who's producing today, who's helping us out, has already shared the PowerPoint slide deck for today in the chat, and she'll also share any useful links that we talk about as we go through. All of this will also be sent out in a follow-up email. And if it would help you with accessibility, please do download this PowerPoint to your computer so you can zoom in and out of the slides as we go along today. So on to other housekeeping matters quickly. Hope you've got a drink in hand because we won't be having a break during the webinar. We'll be running straight through. If you've got a question, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can put any comments or reflections in the chat, but it would be easier for us to keep track of the questions if you use the Q&A function. But if you put comments in the chat, we'll be monitoring that throughout as well. This is in webinar format, so your microphone is muted automatically and your video is off. I'm not anticipating any alarms where I am, but keep an ear out where you are. I do have a bit of building work going on, but hopefully you can't actually hear that. And finally, please do respect confidentiality in terms of what's shared by others today. Today's session is being recorded as part of our cost of living webinar series. And by being here, you acknowledge this. This recording will be sent out to all of those who registered for the webinar, and we'll also put this on our YouTube channel, along with our other cost of living webinars sponsored by Utility Aid. So just quickly run through the agenda. I've done the intro, the housekeeping. Next, we're going to hear from the Charity Finance Group. So Claire's going to share some practical tips before moving on to Freya, who will talk from a small charity's experience of managing their finances. And we'll be leaving plenty of time for questions and answers. Please do put them into the Q&A throughout. And finally, we've got a bit of signposting for you before we close up in time. Oh, that timing is wrong. It's an hour. It's a couple of hours behind. I've just realized that. So we'll be finishing at 3 p.m. not 1 p.m. Okay, I think I'll hand over to Miriam. So we're just going to run through a couple of polls so we can find out a bit more about who we've got here today. So the first poll should be up on the screen now. It'd be great if you could answer that. Do you have a reserves policy? Yes, and we have our target reserves. Yes, but we don't have our target reserves. No, and we are developing one currently. So I'll just give a little bit longer for everybody to participate in that. Really interesting. Nearly everybody participated. If you haven't, if you could just take a second just to give an answer. Okay, Miriam, I think you can share the results. So everyone should be able to see that. We had 88% of people here participate, and 71% say that yes, and they do have target reserves. So we'll share these results with everybody as well when we send out the email. Okay, we've got a second poll. So we want to hear from you in terms of what is keeping you up at night. So I've put a few options there for you, but if you do want to give another option, you can choose other and you can put that in the chat as well. So finding the money you need, recruitment and retention of staff and volunteers, supporting the mental health and well-being of your team, rising costs, how to meet increased demand for your services, or is it something else? And if you do choose other, please do note that in the chat, as we'd really like to hear about the issues that you're facing right now to help us think about what InCVO can do to help. All of the above. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me either. I should have put that as an option, shouldn't I? If you think about the one greatest thing, the biggest issue for you right now, which I know is not really easy to think about. Okay. People are still choosing their answer. Okay, we've had 85% of people participate. I think we can probably share the results, Miriam. So you should be able to see that. Number one, finding the money that's needed. Followed by, I think it looks there, rising costs and recruitment and retention of staff. Yeah, fairly even spread there in terms of the issues you're facing, but we'll share those results as well in the follow-up email. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, that's all from me for now. I'm going to hand you over to Claire from CFG to talk about your finances.
Okay, thanks, Amy, and hello, everybody. Lovely to be here with you this afternoon, and big thank you to InCVO for doing all the logistics and housekeeping of making this come together. And I'm really pleased that later on we're going to be hearing from Freya from Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide or SOBS as well, because I think she'll have some really interesting insight into what it's like in a real life situation. But over at Charity Finance Group, well, what do? We work to support a charity sector that is financially confident, dynamic and trustworthy, with finance really at the heart of strategic decision making. We want charities to be able to use finance as a tool to really maximise your impact. So making every pound you have work really as hard as possible for you and for your beneficiaries. And we do this through our practical support, our helplines for members, training, events like this one, sharing knowledge and sharing expertise. And we're really regarded as the go-to body for all things charity finance, as well as working on leadership, governance, and the wider category of resources. So that's people, property, all those things. And we also support the sector through our policy work. So most recently, that's been focused on the next budget, which is coming on the 16th of March 2023. And we've also been doing some work on updates to Charity Commission guidance around internal financial controls, investment policies, and the changes to the annual return. Charity Finance Group, along with InCVO, is also part of the civil society group, and that's where we combine our efforts really and collaborate on diverse but important issues for the whole sector, such as the energy bills discount scheme, dismantling racism, the coming procurement bill, and, as I mentioned, the budget. Now, policy work at the present is really being dominated by the cost of living crisis, and alongside the kind of asks and successes we've been making in the policy space, we've been trying to gather some practical tips to help you keep running your charity. A little bit of context to that. As you know, inflation is still at a very high level. The rate of inflation seems to be slowing, but that doesn't mean prices have stopped rising. They're just rising more slowly, and certainly not much sign of prices going back to where they were, say, a year or 18 months ago. Energy prices are significantly contributing to inflation. There are issues around security of supply, the drive to now really accelerate that move away from fossil fuels and perhaps into renewables, or at least homegrown energy, so that we can have more energy security. But that is obviously going to take several years to come into a real effect. And the labour market's causing big problems. 17% of you said staffing was or recruitment and retention was an issue. We've got low unemployment. Historically, we've usually had we've had high inflation and high unemployment. So this is an unusual situation to have high inflation and low unemployment. It means there's a lot of pressure on the labour market. And you'll know that if you're trying to recruit people, if you're trying to hold on to people, or if you're coming under pressure around pay. I'm going to be Chris Whitty now. Remember him? So if I could have my next slide, please. Thank you. So thinking about how we respond to the cost of living crisis in relation to managing our organisation, I think there are two sets of ways that we can think about this. And the first is to think about different ways we can approach the problem. We can either throw our cold hard cash at something, or we can try and find low or zero cost measures. This slide did say zero cost, but I just think that's unrealistic because everything has a cost, even if you're having to factor in stuff, nothing more than staff time, because that costs money, right? So quite often we find we need to combine the two, the cold hard cash element and the low cost option. If you think about energy costs and the way you're trying to manage your energy costs, you may be able to spend some money and say change all your light bulbs for LEDs or do some insulation on your property. But you may also want to combine that with a low or no cost option, which would be, say, a behaviour change campaign with your staff and the people who use your premises, getting them to turn things off, turn off computers when you go home, turn lights off when you're not in a room, only boil the kettle with the water you need in it rather than a full kettle. So combining those two cash, no cash options. The other way to think about it is maybe in terms of tactical versus strategic options. So if you're looking at your staffing budget, for instance, you may be able to reduce your spend against that budget by carrying some staff vacancies, either willingly or unwillingly. You might just not be able to fill those posts at present. That will, of course, reduce your spend on staffing. But another way to think about it might be more strategically. You might be needing to think about, do we have the people doing the jobs we need to do right now? Or do we need to think about maybe rejigging the structure of the staffing? Another example would be if you currently offer a service that costs a lot of money to deliver, so you reduce the number of people you can support or reduce the hours that service is open. That would be a tactical way of looking at it. But maybe thinking more strategically, you'd be looking at a different way to shape that service. Can you deliver it in a different way? Can you use another method of meeting those beneficiaries' needs? So really two ways of thinking about responding to the cost of living crisis there. Freya, could I have the next slide, please? So looking at these different areas, we can think about all of these six in relation to both tactics and strategy. And handily, I was able to find a word beginning with P for each of these. So what do we mean by the 6 Ps? Well, firstly, people. We need to think not only about paid staff, but about volunteers. How can we make sure that our recruitment efforts are getting the results we want? How can we make sure we are putting those vacancies we've got in front of a diverse audience of people so that we can attract from a wider pool? Recruitment and retention. Retention, how can we keep the people we've got? How can we make them feel that they want to stay, that they are valued, that they are getting sufficient reward for the work that they are doing? And when I talk about reward for work, that applies to volunteers as well. How are you showing how much you value and appreciate the work that they do or the contribution that they make to your organisation? So have a think about, how do you demonstrate the values that are at the heart of your organisation? How are you living those values? How are they reflected in your behaviours in terms of not just the way you interact with beneficiaries or service users or with the wider community, but also what it's like on the inside for the people that work with you? That really all contributes to building up your culture as an organisation. And we do know at the moment, people are leaving the sector to go and work in other organisations or other parts of the economy because they're being driven that way by price. So we need to think, we quite often can't compete on wages in the charity sector. So we need to think how else we can do that, whether that's by introducing additional leave or excellent policies on supporting people with caring responsibilities, professional development. What else can you do? Go back to thinking that tactics and strategy. What are your low cost or no cost options that you can add value to somebody's role without necessarily giving them a massive pay rise that you maybe can't afford. That's the other issue with pay rises. If you give people a pay rise, you are wiring that into your future budgets. So you may want to have a think about a non-consolidated payment to supplement wages, but not actually build that into future years to come. So second P, place, premises, property, the buildings that you use to deliver your service. You're going to be looking at energy costs, but also any other running costs you've got with that. If you're solely responsible for your building, are there ways you can maximise the use of it? Can you sublet any of it to somebody else? Can you share with another organisation? We've recently been sharing part of our office with the Association of Chairs because we're simply not using our office all the time. So getting somebody else to come and use some of that space makes good sense. It means that we're not the only people that are paying all of the costs. So there's that. And finally, have a think, you go back to that tactics versus strategy. Strategically, can you deliver your services in a way that means you no longer need the expensive upkeep of a building, or you can move to smaller premises? So try and think about the two different elements again. Now, the third P is procurement. I'm particularly interested in this because I've been following the procurement bill working through Parliament at the moment. Really, it's about buying in your materials, your things you need to deliver your services. And I would say this in this area, the best thing to do is that relationship building that you have with your beneficiaries, do some with your suppliers as well. Try and get some conversations going with your suppliers about what it is you need, and also factor in when you're likely to need things in the year ahead. Doesn't stop you shopping around, but you might find having that relationship means you'll get more information about if they can reduce price or if there's a deal coming up, other ways you can maximise your purchasing power with that organisation. The fourth P is products, and that really means the services you offer. What do you do? What is the offer that your charity has? What do you do in your community or with your beneficiaries? Do you need to keep doing it? Could you do it differently? We'll come back to that with my next slide, but first we'll finish this. So fifth P is for partners. That's really thinking about your contracts and your grant income. Are you benefiting, or are you able to leverage an increase in contract price or in grant funding in line with inflation? We know that some funders have been really proactive in writing to their grant recipients and offering them additional funding to match inflation. If that's happened to you, brilliant, that's one thing already squared away. But if not, please do make contact with anybody that gives you grant funding, because I'm in the northeast of England and we say here, shy Ben's getting out. So that email or that phone call, it might not take very long, it might pay off, you never know. And if not, well, you're showing that you're proactive and you're thinking about your charity's financial situation, which is still a good thing to be doing. There's work going on. I talked about the budget earlier. One of the requests or the asks that the sector is making of the Treasury is that there should be support in contracting for public services to give charities an uplift in line with inflation. Again, we know that our local authority colleagues in particular are equally strapped for cash, but it's still worth having that conversation with them. You know, governments, local and central, make decisions about where to spend their money, and saying that there's no money to give you an uplift means, yes, they're up against it, but also they are deciding to keep their funding in other places. Again, if you don't ask, definitely won't get. So please do make that ask. And the final P is plenty, which is my handy alliterative name for reserves, which I know Freya is going to talk about in a while as well. I was pleasantly surprised by the poll earlier that says a number of you had, a good number of you had your reserves within your range. That was really good news, because we know that for the last 3 years, charities have been working with people who find themselves in really vulnerable and complex situations, and spending reserves has been one way to get through the crises. I don't like the phrase perma-crisis, but it has started to feel like that lately. What I will say is, if you've got reserves, now is the time to make sure they're really working hard for you. The rise in interest rates is a nightmare for lots of households, and it's affecting mortgages and private rents, but it does mean you might be able to get a little bit more return on your investments. And we work with a range of corporate partners to bring advice to our charity members and to help you maximise your strategic aims. So there's lots of resources on CFG's Knowledge Hub about reserves. Please do have a look. Some of it's restricted to our members. Sorry about that, but please do join us if you find something there that you want to have a look at. Having said that, we do have a cost of living hub on the Charity Finance Group website, and all the resources there are free to everybody because we know how tough this is for people. Okay, I said I was going to talk about products. Can I have next slide, please? So this is a way of thinking. This is just a little thought exercise. I'm just going to explain it to you and let you go away and play with this in your own time. But this is thinking about what you do on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis. Now, bucket number one, that's the blue bucket on the left. What do you absolutely have to keep doing in exactly the same way that you currently do it? So that's bucket number one. Have a think about what you do that goes in bucket number one. The bin, we'll go over to the right now. What can you stop doing? What have you been doing because it's a chairman's special project? What have you been doing because you've always done it? What can you put in the bin? What's taking your money and not delivering for your beneficiaries? I think the bucket in the middle, the orange bucket, is actually the most interesting one. What do you want to keep doing? What do you need to keep doing? But you might be able to do it differently. And this is the time to think about services you deliver under contract. Is there a way you can change those? And services you deliver for your beneficiaries. Maybe you have a space that's open for a significant part of the day. Can you close it for an hour earlier in the morning when only one person comes? You know, you can have a conversation with that one person and say, we're going to have to just change our hours slightly. We know this will be difficult for you, but for the long-term good of the project, we need to cut our costs a little bit. So just taking that space, and I know that's a huge ask at the moment, finding space for thinking, but see if that 2 buckets in a bin helps you make some interesting decisions, or at least spark some interesting conversations. Okay, I think that's me for now, although I'm going to have a bit to say later about insolvency. So I'm going to hand over to Freya Leaf now, from Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide. Freya, over to you.
Hi there. Thanks, Claire. That was really, really interesting, actually. And it's great that some of our stuff overlaps. So hopefully I'll be able to kind of talk about how we've done things in practice, but I could definitely identify with what you were saying. Okay, so here we go to financial planning in times of crisis. Let me just, what a time for it to stop working. So who am I? I'll just give you a quick introduction. I'm Freya Leaf. I'm the chair of the board of trustees at Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide, or we sometimes go by SOBS. I've worked in finance for 12 years, happily, I think. I'm a management accountant, so I'm a CIMA qualified accountant, and I'm about 5 years post-qualified. My background is largely cost control and then profit enhancement. And then I've also got a bit of a background in treasury. So I would say when it comes to this kind of thing, I'm the kind of accountant that people turn to ask them to lend a hand and understand how they can make themselves a little bit more efficient. But more recently, I moved out of the sort of corporate finance side of things, and I became a head of purpose, which is a funny job title, but it's essentially I give grants to women's and girls football clubs and then help them utilise those funds to make sure they're getting the most out of it to increase the provision of football for girls. So just quickly, I'm sure most of you know, but what are the current pressures that people are facing? I think we all know, and Claire spoke about it, the costs for everything, it seems, are increasing. And I think it's also fair to say there's an increased need. It's not just as simple as saying that my bills have gone up. It's also my bills have gone up and I need to help 10 more people. You know, it's a double layer. There's reduced income, which puts all of the pressures onto the bottom line. So you're kind of being squeezed from every angle. I think it's fair to say as well, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. So everything that I attend that's to do with finance, some people say it will be fixed by the end of this year. Some people say the end of next year. Some say it's going to take 10 years to kind of recover. Nobody's really sure what the government is doing, what they're thinking, who will even be leading the country. It just feels like there's all sorts of uncertainty, which I think increases the need further, and also just makes everything very unpleasant and very difficult to manage, particularly from a financial perspective. One of them, the other part, as Claire spoke about, the recruitment requirements. So I think we've seen a dramatic change. It's been spoken about a lot, but 2020 completely changed the way that people expect to work, and it's completely changed their expectations of what the workplace should provide for them. So it's making sure that we're kind of moving with these things, but sometimes expenses do come alongside it. So I think, oh, I can't actually see what the bottom one is. That's helpful. So it's just kind of all of these different bits and pieces. They're all the pressures, and I'm sure you all know about them, that you kind of need to take into account when we try and work out how we're going to get to kind of the midpoint of this year and then the end of this year. So what can we do? I'm sure that's something that you've all kind of thrown around the table. I think planning is probably the easiest solution to work out what it is that you actually need to do. I think a lot of the time it's very hard to, it's very easy to get stuck in the thought that I want to get here, but I can't. I don't know how to get there, or we don't have the money for this. And if you start breaking it down into little pieces, you'll find that as you pull together a plan, you'll see that there are some solutions out there. But specifically today, kind of want to talk about what does that mean? And I think a lot of people talk about budgets, and they talk about 5-year business plans and all sorts of pie in the sky ideas. And I think they are really, really important. Don't get me wrong, I think they're incredibly valuable. But sometimes budgets, I think the last 2 years has probably shown us that you can have a budget, but actually you need to be much more hands-on and real-time in your approach to your finances. And whilst that 5-year business plan is absolutely essential, you should definitely know where you want to be. I think that's fantastic, but having a 5-year business plan won't help you get through the next 6 months, or it will be very difficult to help you get through the next 6 months in a practical sense. So budgets from 5-year business plans, they're not really what I've got in mind, to be honest. I think what I'm talking about is cash is queen. So I think I get tired of hearing that cash is king. Being a woman, it's got to be cash is queen. If you're not a royalist, then obviously Freddie Mercury and his crew. So I think what I'm just going to focus on now is a small portion on cash flow forecasting, because I think this is really, really important. And I think it's sometimes neglected. People think it's really important to build a great budget, a great detailed budget. And it is, but what people sometimes lose sight on is the fact that they're going to have a deficit in their bank account within the 3rd month of the year. So if we just kind of come on to this bit here, this is something that we've really focused on in SOBs to make sure that our cash flow is right, because we don't want to reach a point where we're incurring finance costs and things like that. So where do you start? It's always got to start with a bank balance, essentially. How much cash do you have on hand at the moment? I'm sure if there are any treasurers or there are any finance officers here today, you'll probably know exactly what your cash balance is. Then you need to work out what are your fixed costs. So those are the ones that are month in, month out, week in, week out. They're the ones that you can't avoid. You're potentially contracted into, so you've got to pay them. Then hopefully you've got your expected income. So there'll be things like your grants, or if you have something like Amazon Smile, you know that roughly you get £1,000 a month that come in from there. You know, there could be all sorts of things that hopefully you'll be able to plan. So you just kind of want to make a list of all of these things. And if you've got anything that says on off, but it's meant to be one-off, or if you run a one-off event, so say you have a big ball or a comedy evening where you know that generally you'll make a big lump sum of money, but you know you're going to have some outlay to come with it, that will be something that you need to make sure you're taking account of. So just kind of covering off the bits and pieces I've just spoken about. I think the most important thing to remember, the most important thing to try and do is keep it simple. So it's great to have like the granular detail and to dig out exactly what down to the pound you're going to be getting. But I think if you know that you get about 10 grand for one grant and 15 grand for another, and they always pay you in March and June. You know that your fundraiser roughly gives you X, Y, or Z, and then your donations generally roll in at that sort of point. I think keep it fairly high level and then try and work out your outgoing. So hopefully you'll know your salaries, you'll know your direct debits. And the quickest way for you to get these things is to just download them out of your bank statement. That's what we do. We either take it straight out of QuickBooks if all of our bank accounts are loading into it, which I don't know if anyone uses QuickBooks, but sometimes it's an absolute flipping nightmare, as only 50% of the banks we use seem to feed into it. But you can do something, and if it would be useful, I can share this to you. It's just a very simple little document where you can add some lines in and put in to work out what your cash flow will be. And it's always nice, I think, it kind of helps drive home to people where there might be a problem. So we can see kind of in May, it really drops down and we know that we've got a problem. And if we have a little look, we can see that there's a big variable cost that's coming out of there right in between the two grants. So these are the bits that will hopefully help you find your pinch points. I think it's a really valuable exercise just at a high level to try and work out what it is that your charity may be needing over the next 6 months. I think try not to get bogged down in the idea that it needs to be a year. You can update it on a month-to-month basis as you know what's going on. Kind of as you close each month down, you can update your bank balance and put in what you think is going to happen in July as February closes out, or January closes out, sorry. So what do we know? Just going to have a little run through on that case study. So we know that in May, the charity will begin to face problems. We know that the fixed costs outweigh the forecast income. We know that salaries are their biggest outgoing. And we know that we have good grant income, but the timing might be trouble. So if you're kind of faced with these types of problems, that things don't line up for you in a helpful manner, so things like the grant income comes 1 month after you know you're going to have a variable cost come out, I would say that it's a good idea to kind of reach out to your grant givers and ask if you could maybe get the money a month early to make sure that you don't go into that deficit position. I would also recommend, I think Claire spoke a little bit about when you're dealing with your, not your products, your procurement, managing that relationship just to make sure that you're kind of on good terms with them. But that could also mean that you could delay that invoice by a month, and still stay on good terms with them. It's just about building the relationships with the people that you're working with, to make sure that your cash flow stays helpful. I think salaries being the biggest outgoing is something that will probably be common across most charities. I think we're not often, we're not manufacturing firms. Our people are our biggest asset and our biggest outgoing. And Claire spoke about the sorts of things that you can do that aren't money related. So, and that's something that we've definitely moved to do. So we've offered additional annual leave. So we've put a focus on long service, and we've given well-being days off for birthdays. And I think these things are all quite standard, but I think for existing members of staff, if you don't have those sorts of things, it's worth reaching out to somebody that knows a bit about HR and what the market looks like. Have a look through loads of different job descriptions and find out what it is that is drawing people to the companies that people think are really nice to work for. If you have a look at people like Innocent Smoothies and stuff like that, what's the corporate world doing? Because they're suffering the same problems that we are, but sometimes they can be a little bit quicker to move. So and they're our competition in terms of losing staff and reducing our retention. So I think they're not necessarily, I'm not saying that you can cut people's wages, because that's definitely not what you can do, but when you're recruiting in, you could perhaps manage your salaries as Claire said, when the vacancies appear, you can either manage by reducing your headcount and not filling that seat, or you can, when you're recruiting back in, look to try and amend what you need to pay by offering benefits that aren't cash. So what questions might we have? Can any of our fixed costs be reduced? I think that's a really tough one, particularly at the moment where we know that things are going up. It's something that you can review as and when contracts become contracts expire normally. So if you've got things like a mobile phone provider that gives you something that we have, they provide us with a lot of phones, and at the end of that 2-year period, I think previously we've let it run over because it's been thought of as a big headache to try and amend it. But I think realistically now we're going to be reviewing it and making sure that we're getting the most economical deal. Can we move or control our variable costs? So that's kind of what I was talking about. If you've got that big bill that's due to come out and it isn't one of your regular ones and it's not fixed, can you move it? Can you move it to a point where it's actually more convenient for you? If you have an event that you run, does it need to be in that month, or could you push it back 3 months? Do we have any reserves? I'm just realizing I'm going to run out of time. So do we have any reserves? Can we use those to spend our money? Do we have any outstanding grants that need to be chased? So this is something that happens to us, I think, particularly with local authorities. You kind of know that they'll end up paying you come the end of March or the first week of April, but they've said they'll give you the money in the summer previously. So you can ring these people up, chase them. Do we have access to finance? Could we borrow money? Is there anything that we could do to make sure to tide us over for that period? And I can't read what that one says because my thing is covering it up. Can we ask for the grant to come earlier? So I think that's all kind of covered it all. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about reserves. So what are they? What's appropriate? Can we invest them, and are they necessary? I was really pleasantly surprised as well to see what a high percentage of people have the reserves. They have the policy and they have the cash. So I think Claire also spoke about investing them. Absolutely, you should invest them. I think we all know that £10 last week is worth more than £10 in your pocket today, and that's just the time value of money. So there are lots of different places that you can go to. I'm sure CFG and NCVO would be able to give you some advice on where they could be invested. Just talking about what's appropriate. So at SOBS, we hold 6 months worth of our fixed costs and variable costs that we know are likely to come out. I think if you can hold that much, you're very, very fortunate. I think 1 quarter is also kind of appropriate to hold on to, particularly when you kind of don't know what's around the corner. To give yourself a 3-month buffer is really important and could be precious, particularly when you're talking about covering things like salaries. This is just an example of our reserves policy. So it doesn't have to be big. They don't have to be huge documents, I don't think. We also have an investment policy that talks about how we're allowed to invest our money. But I think as long as you hit off what will be your operating costs, what's your expenditure, and we also have a clause for any grant funds because a lot of our work is tied into specific areas. So we make sure that we always have at least 12 months of those costs to make sure that we can meet our contractual obligations. And then we detail out how much that is, and we make sure that we're holding on to it, and we review it on an annual basis, or if we know that there are any significant changes. So yeah, it's just a couple of things hopefully that you'll take away. Planning doesn't need to be overcomplicated. Doing your cash flow doesn't need to be a massive mammoth task that involves loads of people. It can kind of be a 1-person job that looks over the last year to 6 months. Break out your fixed costs. Do you know what they are, and can you reduce them? If you're kind of having trouble with your finances or you're worried about your cash flow, these are the ones that you need to really be on top of. Review your variable costs. Do they fall at a convenient time? Also, can you reduce those or move them? Cash is queen. So you may be fine across the year when you look at it, but you just need to make sure that you're not going to run out of cash halfway along. And finally, it's just, it can be painful to see those reserves not doing much, but they give safety, security and sustainability. So I think they're really important. They're very valuable to have. And then that brings us on to insolvency. I'm really sorry, Claire, I've pinched your time.
No, that's absolutely, that's so interesting. I was mesmerised. And I just wanted to come back and say, we hope we've given you lots of really positive, strong advice, but there are occasionally times when it does all go horribly wrong. And it's really important to understand what to do if you think you might be heading towards an insolvent situation. I spent the first 7 years of my life before I went to university, so mature student, didn't need to put that in there, working for insolvency practitioners and seeing what can happen when companies, when charities, when individuals run out of money and can't pay the debt funds and when they fall due. So what does it mean for a charity to be insolvent? It means it can't pay its bills when they become due, and that's known as the cash flow test. Freya's just talked a lot about cash flow, so that's one side. Or it has more liabilities than assets on the balance sheet. That's the balance sheet test. And cash flow is really important. Like Freya's just said, it's about making sure your money comes in and your spending goes out in a manageable way. And it's about your ability to pay your suppliers, employees, lenders, whatever, on time. So you really need to know that your charity is going to bring in enough income from various sources to cover your costs. That's your budget. That the money will be in the bank when you need to make the payments out, and that every month you can particularly meet the payroll from the funds in your bank. That's your cash flow. So that's it. Cash flow test is, there are two tests for insolvency. Will you pass the cash flow test? Can you pay your debts as they presently fall due? And some that are falling due in the reasonably near future. Reasonably near, it's a bit of a variable phrase, but you will know for yourselves if you look at that whether you're going to be able to do that. And you need to be familiar with your budget and your cash flow and check that the data used to calculate those is accurate, because that means you'll be in a good place to see if things are starting to go wrong. And that will give you, your finance people, your leadership team, your trustees, time to take action before a problem really becomes a crisis. If you think about the balance sheet test, if the liabilities exceed the assets, your charity wouldn't be able to repay its creditors, and there wouldn't be enough money even if they sold everything they owned. And you really do appear to be on the verge of insolvency if your figures for liabilities and assets are very close together. So have a think about that and be realistic about the value of your assets. And it can be really expensive to get in a specialist valuation, but it will give you more accurate information if you're worried that you're in that situation. I would say the main thing to do is, if your figures are telling you your organisation's insolvent or it's at risk of insolvency, it's absolutely essential that you obtain specialist advice, because if it is insolvent or becomes insolvent, the actions of the trustees and the leadership will be examined to find out the cause of that insolvency. So what went wrong, who knew what, when, and what actions were taken or weren't taken in the run-up to the collapse. Operating if you're knowingly insolvent can lead you to accusations of wrongful trading or fraudulent trading, and they're both offences. I'm not wanting to end this on a downer, but I do think it's really important that you know there are risks there. If you're not on top of your data and your financial knowledge, you can very quickly go from things aren't looking great, we have a problem, we have a crisis, everything has gone horribly wrong. So please do follow Freya's advice. Keep on top of your cash flow, keep on top of knowing where the money is and when it's going out and planning ahead. And hopefully that will really help. And hopefully some of the practical tips we've offered as well will help. But I think back over to you now, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you both, Claire, Freya, really excellent stuff. We've run a little bit over, but I think it doesn't matter because it was all such valuable content. If we could just stop sharing the slides for a second, Freya, please. We've already had a few questions come in via the Q&A function, so thank you to everybody who has engaged with that already. And you'll notice that Freya and Claire and myself and Miriam have picked up some of those questions that have come in already. And if you open the Q&A function, you will be able to all see questions that have already been answered as well. There is also the option to upvote. So that's to give a thumbs up to a question that you would also like to see an answer to. So if you do have any further questions, stick them in the Q&A. We'll do our very best to get through as many as possible, but any we can't answer, we will aim to have a response for you in a follow-up email. Any comments or reflections can be put in the chat. So without further ado, so we've got a comment here that changes to funding mean if the post isn't filled, we don't receive the income for that post and would only get paid for the periods it's filled. And I think Claire would like to comment on that.
Sorry, Amy, I was typing at the same time. I think I've been hitting the wrong buttons. Yeah, sometimes that is the case. If you've got grant funding for a particular post and you haven't got the post filled, then yes, you won't have the money. But if it's something that you're funding from your core costs and you do have a vacancy for a couple of months, then that is money you haven't spent on salaries that should still be in your bank, hopefully, or at least in your cash flow predictions. It's not an ideal answer. It creates, basically, we hear about the structural deficit in relation to government spending. That's fundamentally a structural deficit too. If you are, balancing the books by not doing all the things you said you're going to, or by not, saving a bit of money here and there. It can be a good short-term measure. Fundamentally, though, it does mean that you're a person short of what you needed to run your organisation. So, yeah, can be a help in the short term, but I wouldn't rely on it in the long term. Don't know if Freya's got anything to add to that.
No, I think that's pretty much it. You kind of hope that if the bum isn't on the seat, then you don't have to worry about it too much from a cash flow sense. But I suppose the trouble is if you're funding somebody like a fundraiser, then it just ends up being a kind of self-perpetuating problem, doesn't it? You can't get the funds in and you struggle to recruit. But no, I think that's kind of everything.
Thank you both. Some really popular questions here. I'm glad everybody's using the thumbs up function there. So we've got a question here around potential guidance on investment options for free reserves. I don't know if either Freya or Claire would like to jump in on that.
So that's always a bit of a tough one. My advice would be to go to somebody first. I don't know if you have existing investments or not, but when we started looking into this, we went to CAF Bank because they have a relationship with, I can't remember who they are, something like Tilly Investments. I can't quite remember. And they talked us through some of the options, and we were directed from there to a smaller company called CCLA, who some of you may have heard of, and they were able to offer us investment funds that would have different ranges of liquidity, and the return would obviously be kind of in tandem with that. But I think the thing is, you kind of need to go to your board, find out what their appetite for risk is and what it is that they're willing to invest in, and how long they would be happy for the money to be tied up for, potentially, because you may have some free reserves that you don't think you're going to spend for 6 months, so you could tie them in for 6 months or a year or something like that. But I think the best thing to do is to speak to actual financial advisors, and a lot of them are very, very willing to talk to you, because I mean, they want your money, so they want to hold on to it and safeguard it for you. And a lot of them now are much, much better. So particularly for us, with a charity that's linked to suicide, we don't want investments in anything like gambling, or pharmaceutical companies can sometimes be a little bit difficult for us to invest in. And they're much better now at saying, that's fine, we can give you a fund that will align with your charity. So I would recommend going to somebody like CAF Bank or CCLA and talking through with them what to do with your finances, with your cash, because I'm not a financial advisor.
No, important to say that nobody here is a financial advisor.
Yeah.
But what we will do is send some guidance on those kind of themes that are coming up, including investment, in the follow-up email, and some places where you can go for some guidance on that, because I think that would be helpful. I'll try and get a few more questions in before we have to wrap up. Unsurprisingly, a popular question is, any advice about how to go about increasing your reserves?
I think the main thing there is to think, what do you want to increase your reserves for? If you've got your reserves policy that set out, how long you think you need to cover in terms of operating costs, if you've got contingent liabilities, so say the organisation had to close and you needed to pay redundancy to people, do you need to keep an amount of money in hand for redundancy, for repairs and dilapidations on a lease, for instance? But just be realistic about what you would need to close your organisation, what you're saving up for, and when you're planning to spend it. So if you know that in 18 months' time you need to replace 50% of your IT, that's maybe something that you would think about it. But reserves for the sake of it, I would caution against it. There's one other issue with reserves, which is if you've got masses and masses and masses of reserves, how does that look reputationally? Are you doing everything you can for your beneficiaries, or are you restricting what you do now and in the near future for the sake of the longer term future? And that might not, you know, you may have a good story to tell on that. But that's really, think about how your reserves look. I would say the other thing on a reserves policy is quite a lot of organisations now having a reserves range rather than a fixed amount. So you may decide you need between X thousand and Y thousand in reserves, but you're prepared to let it fluctuate within that, can't think of the word, between those two amounts. That's what I'm trying to say.
Range?
But yeah, think about the story you would tell to explain your reserves to somebody that didn't know your organisation, and the justifications you would give. There's nothing wrong with reserves. It's really good to have reserves, but don't feel you need to massively increase them unless you've got a reason for doing so.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, I'm just going to try and at least do one more question, but if we haven't come to your question, we will pick that up. And please do be aware as well that if you have kind of a more in-depth question, you can come to our small charity help desk and we'll put the details for that in the chat as well. I think, judging by what we've got here, I'm going to pick up this question here. Okay, we are lucky enough to have a healthy bank balance and have a policy of 3 months reserves, but I'm not sure I fully understand what money can count as reserves. For example, we are reliant on grant funding, but grants are for a specific purpose, so would not be able to be used for any purpose. So how do we accrue reserves, and how do we ensure that we have enough reserves when funded by restricted grants? Okay, what are reserves? If we could sum that up nice and quickly.
Yeah, I think if it's restricted funding for a specific purpose, then they don't form part of your reserves unless it's, yeah. Because we do have bits that we kind of put into our reserves that are for 12 months worth of cost, but that's a very good question. I would say it's free money that you don't have associated to a specific project to cover your central costs, would be to cover your central costs or costs for projects as you're going forward. I don't know, Claire, if you perhaps have a more detailed response than that, sorry.
It can be complicated. Technically, if it's designated funding, then it's not reserves, or if it's restricted funding, it's not reserve. If it's designated funds, I think it might be a bit of a grey area, because it depends how soon you're planning to spend those designated funds. So think again, you know, if you've got say you've had a good capital appeal because you're going to buy a building, and it's going to take you 2 years maybe to find the right building and for things to actually go through, then I suppose it is reserves because you haven't spent it yet. But on the other hand, it's designated for something. So yeah, check with your accountants or come along to some of our training where people far more qualified than I will talk to you about reserves. Can I pick up on a different question, Amy, that I saw in the chat?
Yeah, last question, Claire.
Okay, so somebody had asked a question about non-financial rewards for employees. Yes. And how do you decide, you know, what are the best options? And I think just a little bit of chat around that, really, I would say the best thing to do is to ask your staff, because different people will value different things, and you know your body of people far better than we do. Some organisations offer gym memberships that are low price, but that might not be what your members want. They might want an extra day off, they might want more flexible hours, so they can, you know, find it easier to juggle caring responsibilities. So best thing for that, have a staff forum, staff survey, do some engagement with your members of staff, because remember, even within your organisation, it's not necessarily going to be one size fits all. Equality is not the same as equity. You want to treat everybody fairly, but that doesn't mean necessarily giving everybody exactly the same thing. You know, if somebody gave me gym membership, I'd be like, oh, thank you very much, but I already go to the gym, it's down the road. But if somebody offered me an extra 2 days holiday a year, I'd be like, yes, brilliant, bring it on. Horses for courses. So that's that one.
I think that's a nice note to end on. I think speak to your members, your staff, about what they would like for benefits wise. I'm gonna have to end the Q&A there, but I'm aware that there are questions that we haven't answered, so I will pick those up. And I'm also going to have a look at some of the themes that have come out of there, because we do have newly refreshed financial management guidance that we've worked on with a few consultants recently. So I'll make sure that we are linking to that in our follow-up email as well. So just a couple of concluding slides. If you could get those up, Freya, please. We might run a couple of minutes over, so I'm hoping everybody can just hold on just so we can wrap up. And I appreciate everybody hanging on till the bitter end. So just while Freya gets those up. Yeah. Okay, so just moving on. Next slide. So there were a couple of resources as well, which we'll share in the follow-up email. I just wanted to talk a little bit about NCVO membership. Just worth saying that although the majority of our content is free to all to access, and we very much target small charities with webinars and practical support like this, we are a membership body of more than 17,500 organisations in England, and NCVO members do get additional benefits designed to save them valuable time and resources, including a 30% discount on training, access to trusted suppliers, and various templates and tools as well. I won't go into too much detail because we're short on time, but it's worth noting as well that NCVO membership is free for organisations with an income of under £30,000. So do look on the website or get in touch with our membership team if you'd like to find out more, because we'd love to have you on board. Just want to hand to Claire quickly to talk about CFG. Next slide, Freya, please.
Is that showing the next slide, or is it just on?
It's still on NCVO.
So NCVO are the purple people, we are the pink people. Please do come along to our website and find out a bit more about what we do, the benefits we offer for our members, if that's of interest to you. We have a fortnightly newsletter that you can sign up to without being a member, but we do hope you'll think about joining us. We provide loads of training, events, special interest groups, and all our resources are available to our members. Some stuff is publicly available, but that's not our business model. You'll understand all about business models, but please just come on over. And I've put my email address in the chat as well if anybody else wants to drop me a line. But it's been really good being here today. Hope it's been helpful.
Amazing. Thank you, Claire. And just our final slide for those of you who are still around. First of all, just a huge thank you to our speakers today, Claire and Freya. Lots of thank yous coming into the chat, and I'll echo that as well. Such useful stuff. Really happy to have you with us today. And Miriam has just opened a quick snap poll just to get your initial thoughts on how today's webinar went and how you found it. It's completely anonymous and we're not making this public, so it really helps us to manage our webinars going forward. And we will also send you an evaluation survey by email. If you've got time to fill that in, it's 5 or 6 questions to give us some feedback on the things you enjoyed and where we can make improvements. We would really appreciate that. And Miriam is posting a link to that in the chat now, but we'll also share in the follow-up email. Okay, so the stat poll looks pretty good so far. I think you can probably share the results. Just so Claire and Freya can have a look. All right. So thank you everybody for coming along. Really appreciate you all being here, and we'll see you at the next webinar on Thursday, hopefully, with Utility Aid. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.